Okay, so we will continue where we left off the other day. So we are still on the topic of plant reproduction. So we're going to start with uh, heterospory. So heterospory is when you have two distinct types of spores that are produced by different types of structures. So that's something that we observed when we looked at the life cycles of gymnosperms and angiosperms. When we looked at the life cycles of non-vascular plants and the seedless vascular plants, we did see that they only produce one type of spore. So when it's only one type of spore, that's known as homosporous. So the spores in these non-vascular plants and in most seedless plants, when they develop into bisexual gametophytes that produce both the sperm and eggs. But that's something that you wouldn't see in seed uh, seed vascular plants. Okay, so the non-vascular plants and most seedless plants are homosporous. So they have a sporangium. Okay, that's the structure that produces the spores. Okay, and the spores turn into bisexual gametophytes. And then you have the gametophytes producing the sperm and eggs. In heterospory, there's two types of spore-producing structures. So we have the microsporangia, which produce the microspores, and the megasporangia that produce the megaspores. So the microsporangia, so in lab, we did look at structures like so in gymnosperms, we looked at structures like the ovulate and the male cones. So in this case, the male cones would have the microsporangia inside of them, and then those produce the microspores. So in lab, uh, I didn't include this step, the microsporangia step, but that's the order of that's how it would be organized. So it would be, for example, for gymnosperms, it would be like the male cones that have the microsporangia within them, and those are the ones that produce the spores, right? The microspores. And then those develop into the gametophytes, right? Or pollen grains. And inside of those are the sperm. Okay. Same for the ovulates. So the ovulate would have the megasporangia, and then the megasporangia would produce the megaspores. The megaspores would develop into the gametophytes, and then within the gametophyte, you have the eggs. So pollen, now talking about pollen, so sperm of non-vascular plants and seedless plants have to swim to fertilize it. So that's why they need to be near water or in moist environments throughout their lives. The pollen grain in land plants allows them to live in dry habitats, okay, because it allows them to reproduce. The male gametophytes are surrounded by a tough coat of sporopollenin, and they can be exposed uh, to air, and they can go without water for a period of time, and this allows them to be carried to a female gametophyte, whether it's by the wind, if they're pollinated by wind, or by animals, okay, like birds, insects, things like that. The seeds also provide is an adaptation because when we look at things like ferns and horsetails, the sporophytes have to live in the same place as their parent gametophyte. So if you remember the fern life cycle, the sporophyte is actually growing on the gametophyte. and it eventually overtakes it, but it does stay connected to the gametophyte. And seed plants, you can see that they overcome this limitation because the embryos of the seed plants are portable and they can be dispersed to new locations separate from the gametophytes. So, okay, so the seed does have um, certain structures that make up the seed. So we have the embryo, we have the nutrients, and we also have a seed coat, which is a protective coat. Okay. So this is something that's different than just say spores, because spores, although they are effective for dispersal, they don't have the the nutrients that are found in seeds. So here is an image um, of a seed on a slide. So we do have the seed coat, which is a protective layer. We have the nutritive tissue, that's the food source. So in gymnosperms, we looked at the mega gametophyte. That was the food source for that life cycle. In in the angiosperm, we looked at the endosperm. So that was the nutritive tissue for that. Then we also have the embryo. Okay, so the embryo, the food source, and then the seed coat. Okay. So in lab, we did talk about the life cycle of a pine tree. So in this case, just to save time, I'm not going to go over all of these, but these are just the the steps of the life cycle, which we already went over in lab. Right? Okay, so this is the life cycle that we went over in lab. Well, I guess I could just go over it briefly, but if you need to go back, if you're having trouble with some of the steps, you can just look through the slides, and the steps are all here. Okay, but pretty much starting here with with the sporophyte. So remember that, and things like gymnosperms, those are sporophyte dominant. So the majority of the lifetime of that plant is going to be in the sporophyte. So in this case, it's a pine tree. So this is the sporophyte, the diploid. The spine, the pine tree or the sporophyte will have the either male cones or female cones. Okay. Within those cones are the either microsporangia, okay, for the male cones, or the megasporangia for the female cones. If it's the male cone, the microsporangia will produce the microspores, okay, and then the microspores, these are the ones, yeah, they look like similar like to the ones like the ones that you looked in lab, kind of have like the Mickey Mouse ears. So those are the pollen grains. Okay? Okay, so the pollen grain in this case is the gametophyte for the male, and this is the one that's either carried by the wind or animals. And if it does fertilize, it will find a female gametophyte. Okay? And once it finds it and finds its way into it, it'll fertilize the egg. So remember that this was a single fertilization because only one of the sperm that are in the pollen grain will fertilize the egg. So after fertilization, then we have the formation of the seed, and then the seed eventually turns into another sporophyte. For flowers, flowering plants or angiosperms are the most diverse land plants that are on the planet today. Okay, there's about 350,000 species that have been described, but that's only what they have described so far. There's still a lot to be discovered. And their success, the reason that they are the most diverse, revolves around their reproductive organ, okay, the flower. So the flower contains the stamen, and that's the structure that has the anthers where the microsporangia develop. And they also have the carpel, which is where the ovary, which contains the ovary, and that's where the ovules are found. And then the ovules is, are the ones that contain the megasporangia. Okay, so in flowers, here what we see as far as fertilization is a double fertilization, because you also have the two non-flagellated sperm. One of them does fertilize the egg to form the zygote, and the other one fuses with a central cell, okay, to form the endosperm. Okay, so here where it says the two nuclei, that's referring to the two nuclei of the central cell. Okay, and when those fuse, you get a triploid nutritive tissue, okay, which in angiosperms is called the endosperm. Okay, so this is the one that serves as the food source. And again, we also went over this life cycle in lab, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just briefly. So here we have the sporophyte, the dominant phase in the angiosperm life cycle. So this one has both the male and female reproductive structures. Okay. Here's the stamen with the anther on top. The anther is the one that releases the microspore. Okay. The microspore forms a pollen grain, which is the gametophyte for the male. And then it's either carried by the wind or animals like bees or uh, could be bats, could be hummingbirds, and they're carried to another flower where it'll allow the pollen grains to enter the carpel of a female. Okay, so that's where the megasporangium is located. Okay, and so if fertilization does occur, then we get a zygote, and then the zygote eventually forms the seed that's contained within the fruit, and then that seed will develop into another sporophyte. So once they evolve, um, so the stamens and carpels, once they evolve, they become enclosed by modified leaves called the sepals and the petals. They have four structures that then diversify to produce different sizes, shapes, and colors. They also have specialized cells inside of flowers that began to produce a wide range of scents. So this is all tied into the types of pollinators that they aim to attract, right? So you have certain flowers like the carrion flower that smells like rotten flesh because it's trying to attract flies. And you have like the long tubes that attract hummingbirds, right? And then you have different colors of flowers that attract different types of bees. So a hypothesis was that the flowers were adaptations to increase um, the probability that animals would perform pollination. So pollination is when the pollen from one individual is transferred to another individual. So biologists propose the directed pollination hypothesis. So this is where natural selection favored structures that reward animals for carrying pollen directly from one flower to another. Okay. So the reason that flowers attract pollinators is because they want the pollination, right? Their they want their pollen to be transferred to another flower. And the reason that the animals visit the flower is for food sources. They want the carbohydrates, the nectar, or the protein, because some, especially insects, some insects visit some flowers specifically for pollen because that's the one that provides the protein, or they'll visit other flowers just for the nectar. So the relationship between the flowering plants and their pollinators is a mutually beneficial one. Okay, so this led to the hypothesis that's called the directed pollination hypothesis. And there's a lot of experimental support for this hypothesis. Okay. One of them was looking at the color preference of different insects, so like moths and bumblebees. So here they wanted to answer the question of how does the flower color influence the pollinator preference? The hypothesis was that the moths would prefer the white petunias. So this is the flower that they were looking at, the petunias. So they say that the hypothesis was that the moth would prefer the white petunias and the bumblebees would prefer the purple, even when the flowers would be identical. So as far as um, structurally and genetically. The only thing that they changed was the gene that codes for color. So they isolated the gene for the purple flower color, and they got this from a related species. Okay, so another type of petunia plant, and they inserted it into the Petunia axillaris, okay, which is the white one. So that turned Petunia axillaris into a purple color, and they grew these in a greenhouse. And then they counted the number of times that the moth visited the different flowers, and also they looked at the number of times the bees visited the different flowers. So they did see that the moth visited the white flowers 4 times more frequently than the purple flowers. And they also saw that the bumblebee visited the purple flowers 7 times more than the white flowers. So this did show that there's a preference among the two types of insects, okay, that's influenced by the color of the flowers. Okay, so the diversity of angiosperms resulted from coevolution with animal pollinators. These evolutionary changes in angiosperms and the corresponding changes in their pollinators were highly dependent on each other. So, meaning that they would not be able to survive without the other. Because, like I mentioned, if there were no pollinators, then the flowers would not be able to reproduce. And then if there were no plants or flowers, then the insects would have no food sources. Okay, all right, so we'll pause it here and then we'll finish the last video on the next one.